Good afternoon. My name is Raheem Thompson. I'm the manager of public programs. Thank you for joining us today for our Lunch and Learn program, Inside Apartheid, One Woman's Struggle in South Africa with Janet Love. Today, Janet will share her personal reflections on growing up under apartheid and what these experiences mean and meant for her in relation to the lessons of the Holocaust as a daughter of a survivor, what led to her involvement in the struggle against apartheid and other aspects of her identity. Janet was involved in negotiations for a South African settlement from the Convention for a Democratic South Africa to the establishment of the Transitional Executive Council. She served as an ANC Member of Parliament and was a member of the Constitutional Committee of the Constitutional Assembly, the body responsible for steering the South African constitution-making process, establishing its first democratic government. Before we begin the program, I would like to thank all of our community partners that were listed on the screen before the start of the program, and I would like to welcome Janet.
Day to all of you. I am really thankful to be here with you, and I have thought the easiest thing to do would be to prepare a video which can then run for, it's around 40 minutes long, and I hope that it is of interest to you. And it's a video in which I try to just capture the experiences and the background, and then an opportunity for us to engage in terms of discussions. I don't know if that's going to work. I sometimes lose bandwidth here, but anyway, we have made some contingency plans if that doesn't work. So I think just because I know everybody has got time constraints, that probably the best thing for me to do is to start the video. And I, as I say, I hope it does. It is of interest to you, and I certainly am grateful for the time that you're giving. Is that okay? I'm going to try and share the screen now. Let's see if I can make it. Okay, great. Let's do that. Just 1 second, sorry. Doesn't seem to be wanting to share. Okay, there we go. No, sorry, everybody. Let me try again. Just let me try. Oh dear, this is Rahim. I hope that you are getting yourself into action just in case. This is exactly why. I'm going to try it once more. Please forgive me. There we go. Is the share screen coming through? Thanks.
Holocaust and Training Museum, growing up under apartheid in South Africa, and reflect. Greetings to you all, and thank you very much for this invitation to be part of your commemoration and your marking of the Holocaust and what it means. My name is Janet Love. I'm speaking to you from South Africa, and I was invited by the Illinois Holocaust and Training Museum to talk about my experiences growing up under apartheid in South Africa, and reflecting on the significance of this for what it means to think about these experiences and to put those in the context of the lessons that we've learned from the discrimination, from the oppression, from the hatred that we saw during the most awful period of European history, the Holocaust. I am one of 3 children of a Holocaust survivor, Dora Rabinowitz. Her story is one of a merchant family in Lithuania being driven from their home in the wake of the Nazi invasion and the ensuing slaughter of the Holocaust. Her older brother Mika was the first to leave, escaping as a young socialist to what was then the Soviet Union. However, upon his arrival in the Soviet Union, he was interned in Siberia under suspicion of being a spy, and eventually he left the Soviet Union at the end of the 1960s together with his family. My mother was confined with her parents, sister, and other brother in the Shaolin ghetto. She was 16 years old. Her father was initially wrenched away. He survived the Krakow concentration camp and eventually found his way to Palestine after the war. My mother was taken to the Stutthof concentration camp. She saw her brother David murdered. She held her mother Jetta in her arms as she died, and she saw her sister Frida succumb to the brutality. April 1945 signaled the advance of the Soviet army. On the 3rd of May 1945, some months after the official Holocaust Memorial Day, Dora was one of the Stutthof prisoners loaded into small boats by the camp guards who were eager to remove evidence and witnesses, and she was sent westward across the Baltic Sea in these boats. They drifted in the sea without food or water for 7.5 days. She was one of the few who survived that voyage before landing in Schleswig-Holstein, where she was finally discovered and rescued by Allied troops, which included my father, Frank Love, who was a decorated soldier of the British forces. After a period in hospital in Neustadt-Holstein, Dora worked as an interpreter for the British War Crimes Commission. Thereafter, she joined the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, and was later transferred to work for the American Joint Distribution Committee, during which time she was placed in charge of their first orphanage, the Warburg Children's Home in Blankenese, Hamburg. She married my dad in 1946. He was a working-class Londoner, the baby of a family with girls, as his older brother had died in the Somme during the First World War. Dora and Frank eventually left Germany to England in 1949. The horrors of war lived with each of my parents in different ways. The experiences of the Holocaust were ingrained in every fiber of my mother's being. My father, too, lived with the experience of the Second World War, not only through what he saw and the horrors that he witnessed, but also he had been victim to an explosion when he was a tank driver, which left him with shrapnel in his legs that remained inside of him until the day he died. My brother and I came into this world knowing that this heritage would always be part of our identity, and yet, like so many siblings, while we hold some views that are very similar, we have followed very different paths. His intellect and medical research have contributed to the common good in ways that leave me awestruck. For me, he has always been a perfect. Notwithstanding the violations and injustices that accompanied the centuries of colonialism, the legal requirement and obligations for all people living in South Africa to practice racism was introduced by the National Party after it came to power in 1948. My parents moved from England to South Africa in 1952, at a time when the Suppression of Communism Act,
other apartheid laws, and the whites-only type of signage were just being introduced. 3 years later, they lost their only child to the waters of the Indian Ocean. Yeta, my sister, drowned when she was only 7 years old.
The gradual introduction of the raft of apartheid laws, coupled with the fact that my parents were trying to cope with the unthinkable devastation of having lost a child, it was probably these two things combined that dulled the senses of my parents to the fact that they were being co-opted into a system of white privilege.
While they did befriend a number of activists in the Congress of Democrats, while they rejected the option to take up South African citizenship, and while we were brought up to believe that there was no legal option to bring about justice and peace in South Africa, such as voting, notwithstanding all of this, their privilege was our privilege, and its effects are part of the intergenerational responsibility and legacy that all white South Africans, of my generation and of generations since, need to reckon with. My mother was a founding teacher of a Jewish day school, King David School, and my brother and I were able to attend the school without the need for my parents to have to pay the significant private school tuition fees. Having a parent who is also part of the staff of a school is not something that I would recommend. However, my dislike for my primary school arose from the fact that as an insulated place of privilege, where Judaism, and especially Orthodox Judaism, was the basis of acceptance, my father, not being Jewish, was a basis for me and my brother to experience a level of discrimination. War, the Holocaust, religious discrimination, doubtless these hovered around me and were a part of prompting my recognition of the immorality of my status. But the main force of nature in my life, who awoke my sense of moral outrage, lay in the person of Nchankha Elizabeth Frida Mamutle. Nchankha was employed as a domestic worker by my parents in 1956, a year before I was born. She remained in their employment after I had left home just prior to my turning 17 years old. I loved her and depended on her, and I was loved by her in return. Nchankha had 2 sons. Her younger son Arthur and I played as children prior to my going to school and before we moved from a house to an apartment. Neither of the children lived with her. This was impermissible under apartheid. Instead, Flasher and Arthur were looked after by their extended family members and went to school in a place called Phokeng, which is about a 2-hour drive from Johannesburg. Nchankha's right to stay in Johannesburg was contingent on her full-time employment, which had to be renewed on an annual basis. She had to carry a document wherever she went, the infamous pass document. This attested to her full-time employment. Failure to carry her pass saw her arrested on a couple of occasions, and it meant that my father needed to negotiate for her release through the production of her pass and the payment of a fine. We lived in a spacious apartment. I had a room that was almost double the size of the so-called servants' quarters in which Nchankha had to live. Hers was a dingy room with tiny windows, with shared ablution facilities, and no hot water on tap. She had to heat her water, wash herself, and warm her food on a small gas cooker in this small space. In our apartment, a hot shower or bath were taken for granted. For people like me who lived in the apartments, We had access to a beautiful shared garden. Nkhankha, on the other hand, had to meet her friends outside the building, often sitting on the pavement. Violence against African people in public spaces was commonplace.
I remember Nkhankha coming back one evening. She was really very distressed. And what had happened was that an African man, not very far from our building, a block or two away, had been grabbed by two young white thugs and had been forced to consume a full bottle of methylated spirits, which was a poisonous cleaning solvent. And just the awful horror of seeing this happen and the sort of sense of complete helplessness that she felt.
So you think that have they got enough to live on?
Not all. Some of them have, some haven't. And there are lots of them who don't appreciate what they're getting. If you go to a race course, you will see more Africans backing horses than Europeans. They waste an awful lot of money at the beer halls also. I mean, these people, they will brandish sticks, which is not necessary. Why must they use sticks and iron bars and things like it to get what they want? There's no need for that. Why can't they come quite like all Europeans do when they have that little strike?
Well, initially, the municipality decided to try and negotiate in the way that one would with white workers. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I don't mean this in any way against the African, but we found we couldn't negotiate. His ways are simple ways, and when we spoke of percentage increases and increases to follow at a later date and more the type of negotiation one might carry out with a white trade union, he didn't understand it. He just did not understand.
Isn't the obvious solution to allow Africans to form trade unions?
Yes, one would, I think, come to that conclusion normally, but you know, here again, the African is not a very sophisticated man at this stage.
My rage against the dehumanization and degradation was stronger than my understanding at the time of the detail of the apartheid system or of the scale of its injustices. Equally, I was unaware of the resistance that was raging on all around us at the time. There was the 1956 Women's March to Pretoria and the campaign to burn the passes. There were the Sharpeville killings, the banning of the African National Congress and other organizations, and the launch of the armed struggle. There was the Rivonia treason trial and the imprisonment of Nelson Mandela, and there were hangings of people like the trade unionist Buyisile Mini. All were events that I had no awareness of as they unfolded. At the end of my second last year of school, I joined a group of Wit students who were involved in building schools and supporting education in one of the Bantustans. Bantustans were the different fragments of land dotted around South Africa. They comprised 13% of South African soil, into which 87% of its people, the African population, needed to be confined. The education provided to African children was intentionally different and inferior to that set for white children. Only prescribed textbooks were allowed, supposedly to ensure that the differentiation was not undermined. But the science books of Bantu education still referred to items such as Bunsen burners, which were never going to be available in places like Bantustan schools. So the student team produced teaching materials and provided supplies to enable teachers in the Bantustan schools to adapt such experiments. The result, this led us to being evicted and banned from returning to the area, as we stood accused of encouraging teachers to transgress this textbook limitation.
Unsurprisingly, by the time I got to university, I had already been fairly politicized, and so my trajectory during my days at university followed that path.
And it was here in my first year at Wits University that I, already politicized, was elected to its representative council and as part of the committee of the National Union of South African Students, NUSAS. However, most of my activism from the outset of my university time was directed at my involvement in an organization called Wages Commission and working on a voluntary basis off campus at an organization called the Industrial Aid Society, which worked in support of the emerging trade union movement that was being set up in defiance of the apartheid regime. In particular, I worked with Metal and Allied Workers Union organizers. It was through one of these trade union organizers that I became involved in the work of the African National Congress in 1975, and later, because of seeing the need to be fully part of the resistance, I decided to become a member of the ANC's armed wing, Umkhonto weSizwe, when I traveled for a short period to Lesotho in April 1976. It was a crazy time then, hitchhiking between Joburg and Durban, from Harrismith to Maseru, from Mthatha to Kokstad. In September of 1975, my flatmate, Jeanette Curtis, who was a founder member of the Industrial Aid Society, was detained together with other political prisoners, some of whom were later on trial, accused of violating the Suppression of Terrorism Act. Jeanette was released without charge just over 2 months later, and upon her release was placed under the restrictions of a 5-year banning order. Nearly 2 years later, Jeanette fled to Botswana with her husband, Marius Schoen, a former political prisoner who was also banned after serving his term in jail. Jeanette and Marius later moved to Angola, where, in June 1984, Jeanette and her 7-year-old daughter Katrine were killed by a letter bomb sent by the apartheid regime while her 4-year-old son, Fritz, looked on. The resurgence of worker organization followed by the Soweto and student uprisings of 1976 were an indication of the significant resistance, overt and covert, that was throughout South Africa. In 1977, shortly after murdering Steve Biko in detention, the apartheid regime attempted to stem the tide of resistance by moving against a group of Black consciousness organizations and a few others in October 1977. The organizations were banned, as were many of their leaders. A wave of arrests followed.
During that time, I was sort of spending my hours off campus helping people who needed to have work of, courier work done, taking, because they were banned, taking messages between people, helping those who needed to get to the borders in order to cross illegally to join the ANC, enabling people to find safe accommodation because they were on the run from the police. So it was a series of support processes, primarily for the ANC, that I was involved in.
It was around this time that I was asked by Beyers Naudé, who himself was a banned person. His organization, the Christian Institute, had also been banned, and he had been a person who had been pilloried by the apartheid regime for having left the Afrikaner Lager and taken up a position of principle. Beyers Naudé asked me to travel to Europe in order to make contact with different people and to set up communication channels for the continuation of work, albeit on a clandestine footing. In exile, I spent almost a year living in a place in Amsterdam which was called a kraakhuis, or a squat, although it was not like any squat that we have in South Africa. While I was in Amsterdam, I worked at one of the anti-apartheid organizations called CODESA, or Holland Committee for Southern Africa. After this period, I moved to London, where I worked on a full-time basis for the liberation movement, operating at the offices of the South African Congress of Trade Unions, SACTU. I began spending time in Lusaka, in Angola, and in the frontline states, those are the states neighboring South Africa, from 1981.
Over the period of 10 years, I moved around to different places. I moved countless times, in some instances in conditions of war. But I spent time in Lusaka, Angola, and what we used to call the frontline areas, which were the countries neighboring South Africa, for a significant period of time.
I was, at the time, put in charge of the communications activity of an operation entitled Operation Vula, which was under the command of Oliver Tambo and Joe Slovo, and was led in the country by Mac Maharaj and Spiwe Nyanda. I spent the next 3.5 years as part of the ANC underground, living and working as different persona, and this ranged from being employed as a graphic designer by day, while traveling hundreds of kilometers to attend to clandestine activity at night. Wigs, makeup, green eyes, and different glasses were a necessary part of my wardrobe. It was a time when periods of adrenaline rush were punctuated with laughter, and times that approximated normality were punctuated by real sadness for people who were not with me or who had been killed by the apartheid regime. Throughout, there was tension, there was impermanence, there was isolation, and there was the loss of comrades. The presence of people like myself as part of Operation Vula remained undetected from 1987 until June 1990, when the security police raided a place that we used as Operation Vula in Durban called the Knoll. This raid resulted in a great deal of information falling into the regime's hands. I, along with others, evaded capture, thanks in part to the support from a community of Dominican nuns who sheltered me, and also as a result of help from members of the Muslim community who supplied me with additional disguises, including the hijab, which I used when having to move around during the daytime. This went on for a year, until June 1991, when I was granted my initial indemnity. I went on to work on a full-time basis in CODESA as part of the ANC negotiation team, and remained involved in the negotiations until the establishment of the Transitional Executive Council, where I took up the position of Deputy Executive Director for 6 months in the period leading up to the first democratic elections in South Africa, which were held in 1994. I served as an ANC Member of Parliament in the first 5 years of democracy, Madiba's government, it was known, and during the first 2 years of our term, the negotiations for the final constitution were also concluded. It was a time of hope, full of energy, hours of vigorous debate, constitution drafting, lawmaking, and constituency work. And for me, I also celebrated the birth of our daughter, a child who was embraced by fellow parliamentarians and who traveled with me on my back between Cape Town and my husband Vusi, who was a trade union leader based in Johannesburg, at our home, and between my home and my constituency office in the Vaal, 45 minutes away. Tandi's first international trip was to Rome when she was 10 weeks old. I returned to Parliament for a year in the next elections in 1999, but I then resigned to take up a 1-year post as the special advisor to the then Minister of Water Affairs. After that, I worked as part of the management team of the South African Central Bank, known as the South African Reserve Bank. In 2005, I was approached while working at the South African Reserve Bank to take up a position of National Director of an organization called the Legal Resources Center. This organization remains a leading human rights organization and public interest law firm, which had been set up by and involved people that I had known during my years of activism in the 1970s. It felt like coming home. One of these people was Arthur Chaskelson, who had been involved also in the negotiations, so I had had quite a bit of contact with him, but who was also the first head of our Constitutional Court. My 7-year appointment as something that complemented my work at the Legal Resources Center, and it happened during that time. Today, I serve in a full-time capacity as the Vice Chairperson of South Africa's Electoral Commission.
So we've established a democracy in South Africa, and many of the systems for that democracy are in place. We have regular elections. We have freedom of speech. We have an upholding in a whole range of ways of very important human rights. But transition in the sense of changing people's lives has not happened. The process of carrying through systematic reconstruction and redistribution has not been followed in a way that has realized the kinds of aspirations and expectations of the people.
Today, unfortunately, there is little acknowledgement by the perpetrators that they did anything wrong, and there is recurring unacceptable behavior, racism, and manifestations of arrogance that show no consciousness of what has passed. There is a great deal of unfinished business. Sadly, within this world, it is the victims who seem to have to do all the hard work of not dwelling on the past and of trying to move forward. To date, our reconstruction processes have lacked the coherence and the consistency necessary, and this has opened the way to the scourge of corruption. Accountability for past crimes and restitution in all its forms has not been effective, and this failure lays a poor foundation for the bringing to book of those who have been stealing billions from the public purse.
There have been a lot of great government programs that have been put in place in order to try and establish the kind of changes that we all want to see. Unfortunately, some of these have had unintended consequences, and those unintended consequences are not picked up quickly enough and are not acted upon with the sort of speed and self-correction that is necessary. There is no silver bullet, there's no quick solution, and like any transition, we absolutely have to ensure that we use as much creativity, but also as much honesty and humility about where we've gone wrong and how we need to take things forward.
Dispossession is brought about through the deliberate actions of others, and is not simply accidental loss. Centuries that involved colonialism, enslavement, and impoverishment now see a persistent legacy of homelessness, broken families, abuse, and violence. The idea that overcoming such adversity could simply be a matter of hard work is not only a myth, but constitutes an insult. The manual labor that built the wealth in South Africa is grueling work.
The problem is greed. It's not just greed that exists in South Africa, it's greed that exists in all parts of the world. And we have to call that problem for what it is. It's the one thing that is undermining the prospects for democracy throughout the world. It's the one thing that is undermining the faith that people have in human rights. It's the one thing that is creating, in material terms, way more inequality than equality, which is, after all, the promise of what the Declaration of Human Rights was all about.
In particular, young people have the very real sense in South Africa of being outsiders, not by choice, but by circumstance. In many instances, they remain undereducated, excluded from the economy, and are living on the outskirts of urban centers with few services and opportunities to change their lives. The result will see an increase in high risk and antisocial behavior. People cannot simply vote away apartheid and white supremacy or its legacy. Additional tactics to build justice and reverse the inequalities are needed. The International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid stipulates that apartheid is a crime against humanity, and that practices of racial segregation and discrimination that fall within this category are defined as acts which are committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group over any other racial group, including through the infringement of their freedom or dignity, subjecting them to inhuman or degrading treatment, through arbitrary arrest, or imposing living conditions that are calculated to cause physical destruction, or by denying members of a racial group the right to leave and to return to their country and the right to have freedom of movement and residence.
My privilege is not something that has been negated through the passage of time or through my involvement. My privilege as a white South African is something that is part of the collective burden, the intergenerational responsibility that we bear and that we need to take forward. I think that all of us are, a product of our histories. Our histories, whether it's family histories, our histories of activity, and even we are a product of our own distortions of memory. But at the end, what we need to do is to still be willing to stand up, to be able to be counted, to be able to live with ourselves, and to adhere to our conscience, not just in terms of one area of our identity, one area of our involvement, but in totality as human beings. As my friend and comrade Patrick Mellett said quite recently, and I'm going to quote him, people often talk about identity and notions of a singular defining identity which can be expressed as color, race, ethnicity, national, religious, or political, or any lethal cocktail of these. So much aberration and atrocity has arisen from this concept of identity and identity politics. Indeed, the evidence all around us has shown that instead human beings are wired to embrace more than one identity. Speaking to you all as a group of people who've come together in a Holocaust museum, of course, prompts me to think about issues that link to my Jewish heritage. My mother was not religious. Her experiences in the concentration camp made her feel that the belief in God was not possible. Nonetheless, she brought us up to own our Jewish heritage, which we do. When I was at school, I went to Ulpan and on Ulpan, and that was a trip that took us to Israel. And even there, I then, as young as I was, I did experience a level of discomfort about some things that just felt to me to be a little reminiscent of the lack of cohesion of a society. And I wrote to my parents around that during those days. My daughter, of course, in honor of her and out of her love for her grandmother, also decided to have a bat mitzvah, which was not something that I did. Later on, when I was working at the Human Rights Commission, I was part of a South African delegation that went to visit Palestine. And I suppose it was on that occasion that the stark reality of what is happening in Palestine really came home very, very forcefully and powerful to me. The division that exists between different people in a very structured way, walls that are erected to stand between two communities, the fact that certain people can only use certain roads and other people can only use other roads. The fact that you have a street which had the old homes of Palestinian people, Shahuda Street, they were not allowed to access their own homes. And this is something I saw through the front door, but had to access it through the back because Shahuda Street was being controlled and patrolled by Israeli police. Olive groves that had existed for generations were being uprooted in favor of settlements that were being occupied by Israeli settlers. All of these things were things that just felt so so difficult for me to kind of accept. And since the legislation that's been passed in Israel in 2018, the denial of the rights of Palestinians to land is something that is very, very overt. And it's difficult, I think, to characterize what happens there as anything different from that which has been described as a crime against humanity, and that's namely apartheid. When I say these things, it's not because I lay any claim to having a solution. I don't think that's the issue. I think that the issue is to be able to stand up, to be able to be counted, and to be able to say that what is wrong and cannot continue. Yes, I have family in that part of the world, Sabra, who were there before Israel even became a state. And I care about them deeply, and I wish that they should also be in safety. And clearly, there is not a possibility for people who are Jewish in the world to believe that safety is something guaranteed. But what I am sure about is that the injustice that is being perpetrated in the name of the Jewish people is something that cannot be in my name. It is unacceptable. And that is something that I believe very strongly as part of my identity. And with the heritage that I bring of my parents, it's something that I need to be able to stand up and say, it must end. As I said before, my mother was very active in the education arena in Essex, Colchester, from the time that she and my father returned there in 1980. After she died, a prize was established and is run from Essex University for school children to be able to take on board their understanding, which is obtained through research and through a fair amount of reading, obviously with teacher support, their understanding of the Holocaust and the importance of it for us to take lessons forward. And at the end of the day, this is the most important thing that any of us who think about the Holocaust can recognize, the importance of learning the lessons and ensuring that these lessons are taken forward. It's an inspirational process where young children around the age of 14 come together in their own time and put together a project which is shows and documents a huge amount of research, involves creativity, such as creating board games, such as writing poetry, such as composing music, such as singing songs. And they come together and they compete with other groups from other schools for a really small prize in order to be able to communicate the message of what the Holocaust is, not just within their schools, but within the wider community. I think that this is the tribute that we can pay to all of those whose lives were lost during the Holocaust, and it's a tribute that I certainly think is deserving in terms of my mother.
In every nation, we face temptation, but we can fight it if we stand united. In every nation, carry the flame to the highest of peaks. We will remember, we won't let this repeat. In every name, memory remains, so we remember never again. Each generation will face temptation. Divided we lose, so we must choose to reject discrimination. In every nation, when ideologies spread, we can be easily led. But history proves power's abused. Each generation carry the flame to the highest of peaks. We will remember, we will let this repeat. In every name, memory remains, so we remember never again. Carry the flame to the highest of peaks. We will remember, we will let this repeat. In every name, memory remains, so we remember never again. We'll dig a future with bricks from the past, ditch laden with hurt. From where can we start? Building a future with history, our teacher. So unite, step into the light. Carry the flame to the highest of peace. We will remember, we won't let this repeat. In every name, memory remains, so we remember never again. Carry the flame to the highest of peace. We will remember, we won't let this repeat. In every name, memory remains, so we remember never again. Carry the flame to the highest of peace. We will remember, we will let this repeat. In every name, memory remains, so we remember never again.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you so much for your video. It was exceptionally well done. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I've seen that there are a couple of questions, and I'm not quite sure if you'd like me just to deal with those, or
Yes.
I don't know how you manage this, Rahim.
Yes. We can start with the first one, but I also wanted to ask you, because some of them were just general statements, but I also want to ask you about your video, and in the process, is there anything that you wanted to share that was maybe left out in the video or that couldn't fit in the time frame? Because we have a little bit of time here that you would like to elaborate on.
No, I there I think it's really what people would be more interested in. There were parts, you know, that one clip that I found of those two people who were commenting on trade unions and so on. I mean, it took me back quite a way, and I realized just how the sense of outrage came all over again, you know, and it's sort of, and yet that was even a moderated thing. And I almost spent my time looking for further clips just to give people a sense of just how bad it was. But anyway, I'm in your hands. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, let's start with the first question. How did your parents react to your involvement with the ANC?
You know, my parents, as I indicated, were very conscious as both of us grew up that if we were going to think about a just society in South Africa, there wasn't a legal option. And so in a way, they were very fearful when they heard that I had become politically involved. And later when I joined the ANC and they became aware of it, there was a mixture of both pride and fear. But you know, I think it was the combination.
Yeah, and
They were supportive. Let me put it like that.
and what was it like when you joined, or what was it, the question is, being white, did it take time to be accepted in the ANC, and what was that like?
So when I was initially recruited, I was recruited because I was already part of working together with people who were involved in the establishment of African trade unions. And so, I mean, my acceptance preceded my recruitment into the ANC. When I worked with people before I went into exile, again, it was the same thing. In exile, you know, it's not a it's a life where you're thrown together with people who are, you know, there was a sense of impermanence for all of us, so we were all in the same boat. I think that really the issue of acceptance rears its head when we come back into the country and the legacy of the divisions is a legacy, and that's the intergenerational responsibility, and it's there, and so that's what you have to deal with.
100%. And what was the negotiation process like? And like what was your roles? Are you able to talk about that?
Sure. You know, when I was working initially in CODESA, it was a very strange time because the people who we were negotiating with, very short time before, had spent a long time kind of trying to find me, and you know, sort of. So the lack of ability to have any confidence in anything anybody said was very, very high. But I suppose, you know, over time in a negotiation process, you kind of realize, as you would in any trade union negotiation for that matter, that it's a give and take. And so you actually have to begin to have some level of confidence, and you do reach certain compromises. As you might know, the negotiations broke down when there was a massacre in Boipatong, which was the area that I was part of my constituency when I was a member of parliament. But I think in that kind of context, it was a very intense process. I mean, I slept very little. Let's put it like that.
Yeah, and one thing I've noticed watching your video, you assumed a lot of different roles and a lot of different kinds of work, and you moved around a lot. And what was like your mission during that time? And do you feel like you've accomplished your life mission as far as in your work, or what more you feel still needs to be done?
Firstly, I would say that I've, in terms of my life mission, I suppose I just have wanted to be able to live with myself, and that means to do what I can do. I'm just one very small grain in the sand. I'll come and go like many other people in the world. But if I do that with a level of commitment and integrity, then hopefully I can contribute to something better. Have I achieved? I mean, I don't, I feel like I can live with myself, but I don't feel as a collective society we have achieved what we need to achieve. And it's not because I think many very good people haven't done very good things, but I think that transition is a hard process. It's much harder to have a transition that realizes genuine progress that's durable than it is to simply, have an election, a democratic election. I look, as I try to say, I look at somebody like my brother who's contributed to the betterment of society through science. Kind of, it's a very different kind of life, but it's contributed in a really important way.
Yeah, thank you. And one more question. How do you think that the truth and restoration slash reparations versus reconciliation might have resulted in different outcomes in terms of equity for people forced into apartheid?
The truth and reconciliation process, I think, had the correct intention, but I think even in having that intention, there were many fault lines to begin with, but those fault lines have been exacerbated by the fact that truth and reconciliation isn't an event. It's an ongoing process. It's an intergenerational process. And I think that that's what we've lost. If I look at the moment, I feel a level of real pain at the fact that people like Jeanette, my flatmate, people like Neil Agate, people like, the Nokutula Simelane these people have not had truth, let alone justice. And if you don't have that foundation of an ongoing process, you're not going to be able to look at the general material environment. At the moment, I'm working in a process that is trying to give a level of compensation to mine workers who mined in the gold mines, who have got silicosis as a result. But it's a drop in the ocean, and so it's something that can't be one thing. It's got to be an ongoing process. And in some ways, even then, there's no guarantee. But I think that's really where our big fault lines lay.
All right. Thank you so much. I enjoyed this presentation, and I hope our audience enjoyed it as well. For those who are still on, please see the survey left in the chat. We will love your feedback, and also a link to our upcoming programs. Yes.
There are a couple of written questions which I can quickly try and answer.
Yeah, yes. If you would like, yes.
I just, out of courtesy to people who've been suffered through a very long video, so
Yeah,
let me
absolutely.
try and answer. Nancy McDaniel is asking whether or not the imprisonment of the former president, Mr. Zuma, would further divide the country. Not in my view. I certainly, he has followers, but I think what the arrest indicated was that we have a country that thankfully the rule of law is still holding strong, and hopefully will be strengthened. In terms of the background, the library background on the screen, I have to say, is a library from a stock photo that I found just because I think it was so exquisite. And it's from the United States, so all power to your libraries. It's a reference library. And I forget the name right now, but thank you very much for noticing it. And I haven't written any books. No, there are far more interesting people and far more interesting books, Sarah. Thank you. I have written articles, but they're on areas of work that I do. Nancy, no, I wish it was in South Africa. I think it is magnificent and beautiful. Thank you. So thank you very much, everybody, and thank you to you, Rahim, and to well, and to the Illinois Museum, and to all the sponsors. I really hope that the work that you do continues and that you have an effect. You've got lots of challenges there in Illinois, but thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you as well, and I hope you have a great night, because it's 7 hours your time, right?
That's right.
All right.
Hey,
Thank you so much, everyone.
thank you all. Thanks.